Hello and welcome to the Project Doctor podcast. My name is Ralph Goossens and I'm your project management expert, presenting you with all the things you need to know about project management. Project Doctor is here to provide you with expert analysis and with recipes that you can put to practical use immediately after the podcast, so stay tuned. I'm very glad to hear that so many of you have already shown up, so let's get started right away. So this is the second episode of the Project Doctor podcast, and we're going to do in this episode exactly what we're going to do in all of our podcasts, which is share project management expertise with you and provide you some recipes, stuff that you can put into practical use immediately. In this second episode, we're going to talk about the goal of the project, the very reason why any project exists at all. As you may know or not know, among the top reasons why projects fail is not understanding the needs of the business and a lack of consensus on the definitions of the business problem. So these are all factors that are centered solidly around the goal of a project. So if you wish to understand how to avoid this pitfall, this main reason for project failure, keep listening, because we will be providing some recipes on how you can avoid such misalignment or misunderstanding or absence of shared understanding on the project goal. You may go to projectdoctor.online to download the extras that come with this episode, and then you will have the key tools that we will be discussing in this podcast. Now, first of all, let's discuss a bit about what types of project goals you may have. There are, of course, different methods to dissect them and to characterize them, and we're going to discuss in this episode a couple of them. The first important thing to understand about the project goal is that it is something very different from the actual deliverables of the project. There is, of course, a link between the goal and the defined deliverables, but the goal is definitely not the same. The goal, by definition, is outside the project. It is linked to the strategy of the organization that is commissioning the project. And the deliverables are supposed to be some kind of realization or materialization of the actual goal. So the goal is more abstract and the deliverables are the concrete stuff that are the end result of doing your project. You can think of goals in a more premeditated breakdown approach derived from the strategy, where the goals might be for several different projects that are grouped together into a larger program. And that would be, let's say, more of a premeditated approach. A second approach to goals is more adaptive, where the organization needs a fast response to some sudden changes in the surroundings. That usually also means that there is less time to think about how the goals are described and defined and how they are translated into the deliverables of a project. So there's a bit more risk there in exactly how the goals are being described. If we hark back a little to the canvas of the first episode, then obviously the project goals are the tile that is most directly linked to what's in the context of any project. So the background stuff like intentions, the frames, the drives of everybody involved, the cultural bias, the subconscious beliefs, the stuff that comes from the language that's being used, basically everything that motivates people to want to change the world around them for the smallest, from the smallest to the biggest things, and the stuff from which all of the ideas for any projects originate, of course. Coming back again to the topic of types of goals, there are three main types that we can distinguish along one axis, which is the first, risk avoidance or risk mitigation, related to either internal or external factors of the organization. The second type could be seizing any opportunity, which would be, for instance, some market window for launching a product. That's stuff outside the organization proper. And the third category of goals would be problem solving, which could, for instance, be related to some stuff in the primary processes of the organization to improve them or to make them more lenient or run faster, etc. So we have these three types: risk avoidance, opportunity seizing, or problem solving. Goals is via the strategic function matrix, which basically is a two-axis model where on the one axis there is the type of organization, which can be market organization or a task organization. Now, the market organization obviously has a strategy for making money, whereas a task organization has a strategy for implementing some kind of change as directed or demanded by the parent organization that provides the task to the task organization. You can think here of agencies that implement a government policy or NGOs or that kind of organizations, not market-oriented. And this split in market organization or task organization basically is the heartbeat that provides the strategy direction for everything that happens in these organizations. On the second axis, a bit less interesting to look at the goal, is the difference between whether they are working capacity-oriented or product-oriented. And this is something that we can talk a bit more about when we talk about business processes and how they relate to projects. The relevancy here is that these type of organizations will have, as I said, two different types of goals, which bring forth a very, very different dynamic inside your project. Obviously, it makes a lot of difference whether you're implementing something strategic that is basically in the end geared at money making, or implementing something that is in the end geared at finding or reaching some kind of change somewhere in society. Looking at how things can go wrong with a goal, one thing that I've encountered a few times in a project is where people have multiple goals at the same time, which are of a different type. One of the biggest examples here that I've come across is where the organization was mixing a goal of problem solving with a goal of opportunity seizing. They actually had the issue that they needed to replace the point of sale system because support for that was expiring. And then they thought, let's take the opportunity to also do something about our declining market position. So let's implement an omni-channel approach and strategy, which is opportunity seizing, and mixing these two different types of goals, which each bring their own dynamic to the project. That made stuff and life for everybody there very, very complicated and delivered a lot of stress from the first to the last second. Would have been prevented if they had just stuck to one type of goal only and implemented first the one and then the other. Another thing that often goes wrong with the goal is mixing up the actual goal with the deliverables. And from within the project, so basically for almost everybody on your team or teams that you're managing in your project, the deliverables will look like they are the goal of the project, because from the perspective of living inside the project world, there's no vision to what happens afterwards, after the deliverables have been provided and the project ends. But for the sponsor, the deliverables are just a means to an end, or at least they should be. So there is another role for you as project manager to clearly explain what's the difference between the actual goal outside the project and the deliverables, and how the deliverables are related to realizing the goal that the sponsor has in mind. You may think of the goal actually as the heartbeat that gives life to your project in the first place. Finally, to understand the goal, it's good to take a look at the business case that the sponsor has developed for the project. And there you will definitely see how the deliverables of your project are supposed to link to the end goal that fits in the strategy, which is either geared at money making or at change making. again, the key reason why this is important is that one of the main failure reasons for projects is misunderstanding or misalignment on what exactly is the goal of a project. So having a handle on that from the perspective of either the type of goal as being problem solving or opportunity seizure or risk avoidance on the one hand, or looking at it from the strategic function matrix on the other hand, gives you a handle on managing these discussions with your stakeholders to get a proper alignment on the project goal. The final recipe that we'll be giving, the final tool, has to do with vague goals, vaguely defined or described goals. And obviously you will have heard about the SMART way of defining your goals. So SMART is the abbreviation for make it specific, make it measurable, make it attainable, make it relevant, and make it time bound. Again, if you go to projectdoctor.online, you'll find a graphic with a chart with these breakdowns of SMART and what exactly you can think of if you want to check whether the definition or description of your project goal is indeed SMART, is indeed measurable, is indeed attainable, is indeed relevant, or is it time-bound. So as a closing remark for this episode, I want to discuss a bit about value management, which is the activity of actually following up after the project is finished and after the facilities or deliverables of your project have been actually produced and put to use, is to measure whether or not the intended value of your project, why you spent all the effort and money in the first place, has actually come through. So that is a post-mortem, post-project measurement of whether or not your goals have been attained, and whether or not the calculations you made for the business case make any sense after the fact. And here we must also distinguish between two different things, which is fit for use and fit for purpose. So it might very well be that whatever deliverables have come out of your project are very much fit for use, but somehow they not fully align with the originally intended or stated goals. So they might not be fully fit for purpose. So you would have two different measures there to check whether or not your goals were achieved and whether or not the expectations of stakeholders were met. Again, because these can be different after the fact, it's very, very much important to have proper alignment on that from the very beginning to avoid disappointments later. So what have we seen in this podcast? We have talked about three types of goals: risk avoidance, opportunity seizure, and problem solving. We have discussed about the strategic function matrix, where we saw that goals are linked to the type of organization as either a market or a task organization, and the functions of them as either a product or a capacity function in that organization. And finally, we've discussed about how to make your goals more specific by using the SMART checklist of defining your goals. Now, please go to Project Doctor Online to download the extras with this podcast, and I hope to hear you and speak to all of you again in the next one. Bye-bye.